Good evening. My name is Webb, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Art Foundation and the publisher of Canadian Art magazine. We are delighted to be here this evening to present our Asia Contemporary Speaker Series in collaboration with the Asia Pacific Foundation, in partnership with the Asia Pacific Foundation, and in collaboration with the Vancouver Art Gallery. Zhang Sheng will introduce Philip Tinari in a moment, and welcome, Philip, to Vancouver for your talk. We are delighted, as I said, to partner with the Asia Pacific Foundation on this series. This is the third talk in a series of 5 talks across the country. I'd like to acknowledge the tremendous contribution of Hank Bull, artist, arts administrator, and fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation. This series would not have been possible without Hank's masterminding and collaborative spirit. So thank you, Hank. Where are you? Very, very much. I'd also like to acknowledge BMO Financial Group and the Asia Pacific Foundation sponsors for support of this program. And as I mentioned earlier, our friends at the Vancouver Art Gallery with whom we have collaborated tonight to present this here in Vancouver. And I'd like to welcome Pao Wu, the President and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation, to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, and let me first of all also acknowledge the many partners we have in this venture. Certainly the Canada Art Foundation, Vancouver Art Gallery, Kathleen Bartels, director, is here together with Zhen Tian, who's on the board, Bank of Montreal for their sponsorship, Hank, who's been a driving force working with the Canada Art Foundation as well as the Asia Pacific Foundation in making this happen. I'm really thrilled to see many familiar faces in this room, but also many new faces, and that to me is a sign that our objective in having this series on contemporary Asian art is meeting its objective. Some of you will know that the lecture series on what we call Asia Contemporary is part of the National Conversation on Asia. This is a multi-year pan-Canadian project on the part of the Asia Pacific Foundation to get Canadians talking about the rise of Asia and what it means for them. And we felt from the very beginning of this project that a national conversation on Asia has to be much more than economics, much more than business, much more than trade. It has to talk about civil society issues, it has to talk about education, it has to talk about human rights, values, and it has to talk about the arts. And this is why, in partnership with Anne and her team at CAF, we decided to launch this series featuring 5 speakers in total, giving their perspectives on how the rise of contemporary Asian art connects with the rise of Asia more broadly. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed the lecture and the networking to follow. Thank you once again for being with us tonight. It's my pleasure now to invite to the podium to make a formal introduction of our speaker, Zhen Tian, who is very well known in these circles. Tonight, he is representing the Vancouver Art Gallery. Zhen.
Good evening. My name is Zhen Tian. I'm a trustee of Vancouver Art Gallery. We are really pleased to that Vancouver Art Gallery is an acting partner for this event, collaborating with Canadian Art Foundation and Asia Pacific Foundation. We feel this is a very important conversation to be part of it, and then in our increasing focus on art from Asia. As you know, Vancouver Art Gallery have been showing many Asian artists, including many Chinese artists, like in the last few years, from Zhu Jinshi, Huang Yongping, Zhang Huan, Ying Xiuzhen, Song Dong, Michael Lin, Ou Zhang, and recently Yang Fudong. So actually you can see the Pro-Asian art program has been increasing in recent years. Last year, Vancouver Art Gallery participated in the Shanghai Biennale. We sent a Vancouver Pavilion. If you had a chance in Shanghai, you would be very happy to see it. It's very welcomed by the Shanghai audience. And also our director, Kathleen Bartels, and Diana led a group, Vancouver Art Gallery group, visit China for 10 days, visit many art studios, museums, galleries in China and Beijing. So I can see in the future there's more interesting exchange program to come. I think next month you will see the offsite. We will have a Chinese very interesting art collective mating. They were made work for the a place in front of the Shangri-La Hotel. So hope you can follow our program and join us. Now I feel honored to introduce Philip Tinari, who is the director of the Ullens Center for Contemporary Art. Ullens Center is an independent museum in Beijing's 798 Art District with an annual public, the visitors of more than 500,000. Prior to joining UCCA, he was the editor-in-chief of LEAP, the International Art Magazine of Contemporary China, Chinese art, which he founded and ran from 2009 to 2011. Since the early 2000s, he has written and lectured widely on contemporary art in China for publications including Artforum, where he was the contributor editor, and Parquet, the New York Times Magazine, and the Chinese magazine called the Du Shu. He worked previously as the China representative for Art Basel and the consultant to the Contemporary Chinese Department at Sotheby's. He has edited and translated numerous articles and catalogs, taught criticism at the Central Academy of Fine Arts, and curated exhibition of artists including Gu Dexin, Yun-Fei Ji, and Xuan, which we showed in Center A last year. Tinari, who speaks, read, and write Mandarin Chinese fluently. He holds a Master in Fine Arts, Asian Studies from Harvard, a BA from the Literature program at Duke, and was a Fulbright Scholar at Peking University. I must add, he also sits in our advisory board of the Issue Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art. So I am very happy to work with him. We have known each other a long time ago since he came to China, work for the Guangzhou Triennial. And we always run into each other without any appointment. We met in the conference, in the exhibition opening, restaurant, hotels, even in the luggage picking area in the airport. So I'm very happy now today to welcome Philip to Vancouver. Hope you enjoyed the talk.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. Thanks to the Canadian Art Foundation, to the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and to the Vancouver Art Gallery for having me here tonight. And many thanks to Hank and to Christine Shaw for all of their organizational efforts. I should start by saying that Vancouver looms very large in the collective unconscious of Chinese contemporary art, mainly owing to the man who I am very honored to just have been introduced by, but also through important projects such as the 1990s survey show Jiangnan, which talked about art throughout regions in China, the journal Yishu, which was until LEAP was founded, the only regular English language source of information coming from the contemporary Chinese art world. And all of the other amazing projects that are happening here at all times. So I'm embarrassed that I actually haven't been here for 15 years. And when I was here, I was a college student on the way to Whistler. So this has been a great, albeit extremely brief, chance to get to know a little bit about these institutions that I've been hearing so much about over the years. And it's exciting to see a city that is so actively engaged with the part of the world that I, for the moment and for some time now, call home. So this is a huge honor, and that's all I have to say. And then I should just speak very briefly to the question, which is always everyone's first question, which is how did an Italian-American kid from Philadelphia end up running a museum in Beijing? And it all has to do with Duke, where I went to college and where I was studying very closely with a guy called Michael Hart, who I understand is also a big presence here in Vancouver as well. And through this kind of nexus of post-colonial theory and globalization and cultural studies in the late 90s, as part of this kind of very American academic discourse, was sort of steered in the direction of China and then of contemporary art, and have been lucky to be there over the last 10 years and really watch firsthand as a whole world has kind of taken shape all around. So, what I hope to offer you in this very short stretch, because we have about 45 minutes to talk and then we'll have some time for questions, obviously, is a portrait of a generation of artists who are quite different from the Chinese artists most of us still think about when we hear the term. So what you will not be hearing about tonight are the nationalist pyrotechnics of Ai Weiwei, and not about the activist iconoclastic social sculptures of Ai Weiwei, nor about the icon-driven painting of painters like Zhang Xiaogang and Zheng Fanzhi, nor even the legions of toothy-grinned steel men that you find downtown on a square in Vancouver from the artist Yue Minjun. Likewise, this is not a story of freedom-loving, oppressed subjects finding their voice through limited encounters with shows by artists like Rauschenberg or Gilbert and George in Beijing, or by passing around a few works of Western art history and philosophy in bad Taiwanese translation while studying at the Art Academy in Hangzhou, nor about artists who learned about the world beyond through correspondence with one or another classmate who had left years before for Paris or New York. No, this is rather the story of a generation that has not enjoyed the luxury of seeing itself as a pioneering avant-garde, or at least in quite that way, even if they have enjoyed many other kinds of luxuries. Above all, they are the first generation to come of age in a China that has offered to them a fully functioning art system where academies feed into galleries, galleries feed into collections, collections become museums, public and private, and this is all attended by a traveling circus of art fairs, auctions, and other facets of commercial culture and creative industries, with a sophistication entirely unimaginable even just a decade ago. I always say when I moved to China in 2001, there were basically 2 galleries and none of the official museums would touch contemporary art. And the project that Xuan and I worked on together in Guangzhou was really one of the first moments, along with the biennial in Shanghai in 2000, when contemporary art kind of found its way into the state system. And even at that time, no one could have imagined what's happened since. The Ullens Center, where I work, by the way, was founded kind of at the very middle of that arc, that decade-long arc, in 2007. So it was set up by a couple of Belgian collectors who have been very involved in contemporary Chinese art from the 80s onward, and decided that the way they would give back to the scene would be by putting together an institution that would promote to a Chinese audience, and in more or less Chinese terms, contemporary art in Beijing. And we mount about 12 exhibitions each year, roughly halfway divided between Chinese and international artists, but kind of always looking to find a Chinese context for what we're bringing in and to put what we're showing from around us into a very implicitly international kind of context. So, in a way, the story that I want to tell you tonight is a story of a generation that is much more recognizable, much more immediately understandable to those of us who have come up through similar systems, similar art systems as they exist in North America and in Europe. And yet in China, surface similarities more often than not belie deep-seated differences. And part of what makes this generation interesting is precisely the limits of using such external comparisons to discuss it meaningfully. Perhaps the most appropriate place to start tonight's discussion then is actually, and Chung set me up perfectly for this, is with the artist Collective Maiden, although I would put the word collective in a pair of defiant scare quotes. Indeed, this name Maiden, as in, of course, made in China, is a moniker adopted by Shanghai's merry prankster Xu Zhen back in 2009. Born in 1977 in Shanghai, Xu marks the upper age limit of the generation I want to focus on tonight, and that is the artists who were born after, for lack of a better watershed, Mao's death, which was in 1976, and around the beginning of opening and reform, which was a set of policies that's paved the way for China's economic emergence that was promulgated more or less late 78, early 79. Xu Zhen, who burst onto the Chinese scene in the early 2000s with a video shown in the Venice Biennale in which he let out a giant scream in a crowded public space and went on to observe the passersby as they walked by, momentarily turning around to see what was going on and then going completely back to their normal everyday routines. In other words, not really stopping to see if the person was all right. Carried out similar stunts in relation to the art world throughout the first decade of the 21st century, notably including the time in 2004 when he convinced the Shanghai Art Museum, which was until very recently housed in what was the colonial racing club on the, what was the race course, which then became the People's Park after 49. It's built by the British. He convinced them to let him speed up the clock at the top of this colonial tower so that the hours passed in seconds. And the following year, in 2005, he replied to a questionnaire circulated by another eminent collector of contemporary Chinese art, Uli Sig, the former Swiss ambassador, who has just recently given a massive donation of 1,200 works of contemporary Chinese art to a new museum called M+ that's being built in Hong Kong, and that will open in 2018. As part of that, I'm sorry, trying to put in footnotes here. So in response to the question that Uli circulated in preparation for Mahjong, which was the exhibition of his collection that toured around the world, and it may have even come to Vancouver, I can't quite remember. It went certainly to a lot of other cities. So Uli asked the question, how does being Chinese affect your activities as an artist? And Xu Zhen's reply was, how does being Swiss affect your activities as a collector? Xu Zhen, who recently exhibited at the Contemporary Art Gallery here in Vancouver, I learned today, and I've just learned is about to create a project here in public space, settled rather effortlessly into the role of ringleader of the young artists in Shanghai sometime during the mid-2000s. He and his team came to run an artist-run space called BizArt, which is in the Moganshan 50 area of Shanghai, sort of like the 798 of Shanghai, now defunct, and generated the fabled website now known as Art Baba in mocking reference to Alibaba, the sourcing website. It was actually originally called Hei Shaohui, which is a joke on the mafia, black society literally, but with an extra radical on the Hei character. It means hey, society. In 2009, so he basically generated an endless string of initiatives. And in 2009, bored with the idea of working as an individual artist subject, he decided to regroup himself into a company, seeing artistic production for what it is, a highly refined subspecies of manufacturing, but also translating the affect of the low-end Chinese corporate sphere, think pressboard cubicles and takeout lunches, into the artist's studio. So, in late 2011, I traveled to Shanghai to see a solo exhibition by Maiden at Shanghai Gallery and wandered into an empty gallery space with a white cube box kind of construction sitting at its center. Thinking I was faced with that old conceptual warhorse, the empty gallery, I prepared to make my way to another space when suddenly sculptures began appearing above the uppermost face of the cube. The sculptures themselves were purposefully trite, boringly provocative assemblages, a tiered wedding cake bedecked with high-heeled shoes, an ionic column topped with a Chinese lantern, a swastika made from artificial cacti, the two characters meaning long live in the same font in which they appear twice on the Tiananmen rostrum in the couplet that surrounds the Mao portrait. This being China, the sculptures were propelled skyward not by some elaborate computer-programmed machine, but by a couple of studio assistants who were sitting inside the cube throwing things up in the air. It was absolutely captivating in a way that these images sadly are not quite able to convey, but you get the point. Now, much could be said about the content of these particular sculptures and the efficacy of this particular strategy of exhibition and display. Maiden's kind of appropriation hides behind a provocative veil of genericized contemporary art vernacular that seems to poke fun at what was recently pinpointed in the online journal Triple Canopy, and then later around many other places like The Guardian as international art English. The connections between over-intellectualized titles and the images they label in Maiden's work are often slim, sending the viewer into a state of contemplation and interpretation that the work means to satirize. More often than not, this critique still understands itself as grounded in the particularly fraught circumstances of contemporary China, with all the interpretive burdens art from this place is generally asked to assume. Maiden announced itself to the world, we should not forget, in 2009, with an exhibition that actually pretended to be a group show of Middle Eastern artists, full of sculptures like an oil rig made from razor wire, or a carnival ride, which instead of having swings had burqas, a waterbed topped with rubble that wobbled. Of course, all the work was actually produced by Maiden. And the whole thing could actually be seen as a joke about the so-called China exhibitions that had been very popular in the 90s and 2000s as a kind of joint way of introducing Chinese art through a series of what he would consider stereotypes and cliches. But what was interesting about this particular project, the one I just was talking about, was none of this. Rather, it was its connection to another exhibition which had opened 7,500 miles away the previous week, and that was Maurizio Catalan's career-ending, again in quotes, retrospective at the Guggenheim titled All. Now, for people who are in the art world, you're of course familiar with the show. If you're not in the art world, it's actually very simple. The artist decided Maurizio Catalan was a very important artist in the 90s and into the 2000s, known for his very ironic sense of humor, decided to hang every sculpture he had ever made from the ceiling of Frank Lloyd Wright's iconic rotunda on Fifth Avenue, leaving the ramps, as they're called, frighteningly empty. The outcry that surrounded this exhibition was deafening. Some loved it, many hated it, and nearly all accused Catalan of being a showman, while the fact that such an exhibition could even happen in the first place said much more about the expectations placed on artists in the Western system than any of the particular critiques surrounding it. And within just 2 weeks, enough of the images, texts, and criticisms surrounding Catalan's project had not only arrived in China through translation and other forms of internet mediation, they had been internalized, digested, and turned into the basis for this piece by Maiden, which was talking about this earlier piece in a very direct way. The big story here is simultaneity. You see, for all the restrictions we imagine Chinese artists to endure, the flow of information and opinion around art continues more or less unimpeded and unabated, and increasingly moves in real time with the world beyond. And yet, interventions by Chinese artists, such as this by Maiden, function on two levels, on an international level and still inside a very tightly articulated series of discursive confines of that thing known as the Chinese art world. In making and showing work, I would argue, artists in China engage both of these realms simultaneously. This piece by Xu Zhen, which I just talked about, functions for me as the opening salvo in a generational story that is as much about the world today as it is about China in particular. You see, the generation now coming into its own has come of age in a world of dichotomies. And here I just decided, for simplicity's sake, to borrow a concept from W.B. Du Bois, the idea of the double consciousness, coined 11 decades ago in his masterwork, The Souls of Black Folk, as a way of talking about the complexities of race in America then. And he said, it is a particular sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. In millennial China, the problematic is entirely different, though it leads to a similar sense of remove. For this is the generation that has known nothing but rising prosperity and influence, and which can, for the first time, begin to make art about something other than the national situation and still be taken seriously. And this goes back to a key idea from another person who's very important in my education, Frederick Jameson, who wrote a really important piece in 1985 called Third World Literature in the Age of Multinational Capital, where he actually looked at the writings of a very famous Chinese writer, Lu Xun, from the 1930s, and talked about how basically works of art that come from outside the core Western context are inevitably read as allegories about a particular national situation. And this is basically the yoke on the shoulders of Chinese artists since contemporary art basically started to happen in the late 1970s, is that any piece that was made would be talked about in terms of how it manifested themes and ideas from this thing called China. This is a divide that has everything to do with the particular freedoms and constraints of living and working, and of forging an artistic practice in China today. So, On-Off. On-Off is the name of a major exhibition now on show at my home institution, the Ullens Center for Contemporary Art, including some 50 artists born at the dawn of Reform and opening. It is perhaps the first comprehensive attempt to map this group, based not on nominations from senior colleagues, but by two curators who are also of this generation, two guys by the name of Bao Dong and Sun Dongdong, who spent a year traveling around China to all the major artistic centers, really looking at artistic practice today. The title refers to a couple of things. First of all is the pervasiveness of the internet and life today, and the specifically Chinese embrace of the internet with all of the limitations it implies. In fact, this name On-Off comes directly from the graphical interface of a piece of software that so many of us who are based in China use to get over the so-called Great Firewall. And that is a VPN, which stands for Virtual Private Network. This is a commercially available VPN called Astral. I actually highly recommend it if you're traveling in China. It is a simple way to log on from a place other than the one you physically inhabit. I mean, I don't want to say really basic things, but I also want to assume that everyone is an internet junkie. So the story behind this is that the curator who coined the title, this guy Sun Dongdong, was an editor at the magazine that I had started in 2009. And in the pursuit of our editorial work, I actually installed this software on his computer for him, and he doesn't speak a whole lot of English. But he did know that at the bottom of his screen there was this box, and if you're on, you can go to any website you like, and if you're off, you're kind of stuck in the Chinese internet, which doesn't include Facebook, doesn't include Twitter, doesn't include YouTube. Of course, has Chinese analogs to all of these things, but for all intents and purposes, feels a bit like a separate virtual space. The underlying condition that this makes apparent is one that goes back far beyond the conceptualization of this exhibition and deep into the childhoods of these curators and the artists they have selected. And this current moment in which we can simply toggle between the two orders, that is the Chinese system with all its constraints but also comforts, and the international system with its easy access to information, albeit at such volume that it often obscures as much as it enlightens, is key to the situation today. So from the curator's statement, I'll just give you one paragraph. Chinese artists born after 1975 have grown up in a society and culture beset by binaries, constantly toggling between extremes. This title On-Off, which comes from the graphical interface of a common VPN software used to scale the firewall, represents this binary condition at its simplest and most direct. This series of tensions intensified notably in 1999 as the internet was becoming implicated into everyday life. And since then, it is precisely this generation of young artists that has surfaced and begun to attract attention. Chinese contemporary art as a whole has moved away from the underground scene of the 1990s and has finally integrated into the commercial art market and the public culture. And coming from this kind of a background, as one such young artist has said, this generation must confront numerous, at times conflicting, concepts and systems. They must make quick adjustments to function within new frameworks. They strive to create a new sort of self-awareness, which is reflected in their artistic methods. China's youngest generation of artists is defined by this widespread feeling of difference. In fact, this is not an exhibition about the role of new technologies in making art, but instead the basic metaphorical conceit of On-Off, which is this binary idea that we're either connected or disconnected over the firewall or inside it, might better be seen as an intellectual structure through which to look at the experience of an entire generation. Perhaps, our curators posit, this is a generation defined by binaries, which grew up in the transition from a socialist economy to a capitalist free-for-all that affected massive change in all sectors of Chinese life. While their education still stressed the importance of collectivity, pressures to define individual identities became all the while more apparent. And after they began their careers as artists, a similar binary has confronted these practitioners between the commercial pressures of the art world and its market and more activist impulses towards self-organization and conceptual forms of practice. The question then becomes, does a duality of systems, and this is kind of where we've gone with this idea of the binary to these other different similar binaries, produce a schizophrenic subjectivity? Or does the constant back and forth become a kind of dialectic of its own? Okay. The notion of the binary is only half the story, however, as the real import of this on-off title lies in both the effortlessness and the absoluteness of this toggling. One can turn this thing on or off with the click of a button, but this does not diminish the vastly different worlds available on either side. In the end, it highlights the fact that for all its increasing resemblance to the rest of the world, China still retains a distinctive, for lack of a better term, operating system. Contemporary art in China, in turn, while resorting now less to outright symbols and signifiers of identity and politics, remains deeply structured by this underlying condition. And so we've just looked at what I would say are some of the basic dichotomies felt by members of this generation. And in the time that remains, I want to address through specific works by specific artists how these dichotomies play themselves out. And this is a very logical starting point. This is a piece by an artist named Tang Dixin, who's worked out of Shanghai and Hangzhou for many years. And this piece is installed in what we call the nave, which is our central exhibition space. It's immediately visible from the entrance and resonates with the same kind of dichotomies that I've just been talking about. On the far side, you see an airplane propeller powered by electric current, and on the other, a jerry-rigged bicycle, also attached to another propeller, on which the audience is invited to climb and sit and power with their feet. Between the two, you have a field of smaller fan blades, something like sunflowers, ready to be influenced by either end. Perhaps this is a metaphor for a contrast between the hard-boiled machinery of the state as it faces new challenges from more organic outlets like Weibo and WeChat and all of these other new channels of information, or perhaps it is simply a very fun formalist sculpture. Another piece that we could talk about would be this by Xi Yunpeng, a playful sculpture which consists of a mechanical bowl like those found in bars throughout the North American West, set atop an inflatable cushion. Viewers are invited to ride the bowl only to discover that it is calibrated by a timed mechanism which more or less ensures that once the riding has begun, the bowl collapses and the cushion begins to deflate. The two states of the piece, which are very literally on and off, vex viewers as they follow in a regulated cycle that nonetheless appears random, like fluctuations of the market or shifts in the political mood. I should say that it also vexes our staff as it emits a bullfighting anthem that has been playing nonstop for the last 2 months. One more to go. And to continue on this question of the binary, this is a more abstract piece that gets the same kind of schizophrenic state. This is by an artist called Liu Chuang, and it's a sculpture which can be entered from two ends. So it's basically a tube inside a rectangle, and the viewer can either enter into the cylindrical tunnel, which occupies around half of the space that these exterior walls enclose, or she could enter into a space from the mirror image side, so the far opposite side, that is defined by, and it seems constantly in danger of being rolled over by, this same tunnel. You're either with us or against us, or kind of part of the solution or part of the problem might be the implied message or sort of state evoked by a sculpture like this. And last in this series of overdetermined large sculptures is this piece by Huang Ran, who who makes actually quite beautiful films as well as more rigidly conceptual pieces like this one. This particular piece features a mesh of metal which carries a low voltage but very high amperage current. It's actually the mechanism, if people have traveled in China, you might know these tennis rackets that have 2 AA batteries in them, and that can be used to kill mosquitoes if you swat them around by electrocution. What he's done actually is juxtapose this with machines which blow soap bubbles. And most of the bubbles hit somewhere on this grid of current and explode in a flurry of blue sparks and another very nice loud sound. But others will make it through the mesh. So these are just kind of ways into this exhibition, and I think a group of pieces that, in a very abstract and yet very direct way, talk about this mental state that I was trying to outline a few minutes ago. Aside from pieces that function on such a direct level, there are many others in which this state is apparent, but maybe in a deeper kind of way. And this is a piece by an artist called Zhao Zhao, who actually came of age as the assistant to another artist you may be familiar with by the name of Ai Weiwei. He is actually from the town in Xinjiang where his family was more or less exiled during the 60s and 70s. And his father was Ai Weiwei's high school teacher, but that's maybe too much information. What Zhao Zhao has done here is taken a huge grouping of already destroyed Buddhist statuary and basically distilled them down to cubic and rectangular solids by chopping them using stone cutters. A gesture that might be analogous to what Ai Weiwei does in his famous photographic triptych Dropping a Han Dynasty Urn, where he simply lets a priceless antique shatter. Different, however, in that for Zhao Zhao, the end game is something that looks a lot like formalist, perhaps minimalist sculpture. It's a perfect cube of 1.5 meters on each vertex. And it requires a great deal of both skill and labor to realize, and has a certain aura of its own, which still, and actually many people are superstitious because the hearts of these religious statues are kind of here arrayed in this different sort of way. Just to give you an idea that politics has not completely gone from the equation. This is not in our show, but this is an earlier piece by Zhao Zhao called Officer, which is about a 5-meter tall statue of a policeman with the artist's face and a badge number that repeats the date on which Ai Weiwei was originally incarcerated. Sorry, it's an old version of PowerPoint. Okay. Then there's this piece by the artist He Xiangyu, which renders a life-size tank, the model most commonly used by the PLA during the 80s and 90s, in beautifully cured leather of the same variety that is sourced in China by the global luxury brands. The tank appears flaccid, deflated, weighed down by its own materiality. And the juxtaposition between the image object and the process by which it is crafted, a process that required, again, a just absolutely massive amount of skilled labor, comes to the fore. Amazingly, this piece has not attracted the negative attention of the censors. I mean, it sits in maybe the most prominent location of the exhibition. And of course, you would worry about putting a giant deflated tank in your exhibition in Beijing. At least I would. But no, somehow this is, it is what it is. It's maybe the critique, if there is one, and I mean, I don't really think it's about 1989 or this or that. It's about a lot of things. It's about the tank as a nationalist icon in its own kind of way. To think of the parades down Avenue of Eternal Peace during the holidays and such. But it's really about the craftsmanship. In any case, that this is able to sort of sit there and not attract that kind of notice is. There are always these. I mean, in a lot of exhibitions I've worked on at the UCCA, there have been these interesting moments that kind of send out signals and perhaps test the limits of what might be possible. But no, the most notable thing about this piece has been the swelling interest of the community of collectors. He Xiangyu himself has a knack for this sort of self-denying pieces. This is an earlier project of his called the Coca-Cola Project, which he claims has no reference at all to Rauschenberg, which is just interesting. But this is basically tons and tons of Coca-Cola distilled down to its coal-like essence. For an artist like Wang Yuyang, process becomes its own outlet and its own way of kind of manifesting the same condition. Here you see 900 sheets of handcrafted paper that are printed with nearly 17 million still images. That's about 20,000, 18,000 per sheet, which document the process of their own creation, from forest to mill to finished product. So basically, he made a documentary of the creation of handmade paper in Yunnan using a traditional intangible cultural heritage kind of method, and has just printed them onto the paper with basically extracted all the stills from the video and then printed them onto the paper in tiny, tiny forms, so that no particular image is actually visible. It's images that are present but not readable. And actually, just to get into this for a second, each row has one more sheet of paper. So the top row has just one, and then it goes on. And that's simply because we didn't have enough wall space for 900 sheets of paper. It would have basically taken the entire exhibition area. If you're familiar with an American artist by the name of Wade Guyton, this might resonate in an interesting way. This is a guy who actually makes paintings using a giant Epson printer. And there's a certain similarity there. But I think for Wang, who teaches in the experimental art department at the Central Academy, process is a way forward. He is perhaps representative of a larger shift whereby conceptual practice is being refined into academic doctrine and enshrined in the art schools. Like Zhang Pei Li and Qiu Zhijie at the China Academy of Art before him, Wang Yang is in his own way part of a national institutional project to mint new artists through the established channels. And pieces which hinge on elaborate conceptualization and execution, pieces like this, are becoming par for the course for graduates of China's new MFA programs, as China's art education system moves beyond the, and this is, I feel embarrassed talking about it in front of Sheng just because he's such a legend in this field, but formerly the most prestigious departments were what we call COPS, Chinese painting, oil painting, printmaking, and sculpture. And that's being changed very rapidly. This move toward process is also visible in a lot of painting practice by this generation. And this is just a shot of the one gallery that was devoted to positions in painting in this exhibition. And of course, you can't really see everything very clearly, but what I want you to notice is that there are no pink babies, no green dogs, and no Chairman Mao with a Coke can. So to focus on a specific piece by an artist named Wang Guanglo, his recent abstractions, this is one of two abstract paintings that are just absolutely giant, were made by layering successively smaller layers of pigment on top of each other, and actually a physical transition from red pigment to green pigment affected by diluting the green with the red as each layer was, each shrinking layer was applied. So that what you get in the end is, of course it echoes Rothko, or it echoes, numerous other positions in kind of post-war abstract painting. But the key to the whole thing is really this very mathematical back and forth with funnels and the sort of surrendering of one color to another by means other than the artist's hand. Wang Guanglo belongs to a group of painters called N12, which is, as the name suggests, 12 painters who graduated in the same few years from the Central Academy of Fine Arts, and who banded together to stage joint exhibitions in 2002, believing pragmatically that 12 artists would draw a bigger crowd than any single one. And his earlier work includes this piece, which is just called Wall, which involves a painstakingly painted, again, massive terrazzo pattern, which he realized on the wall of a studio that he actually knew would be demolished a few months later. Similarly, you have a painting by someone like Siemolin, also from the Central Academy, created using a specially tailored machine similar to the ones used to cut vinyl lettering. For him, this is the basis of a painting process that's about experimentation, and that functions very much like a laboratory. So this was the first one that he did that actually incorporated tiny bubbles in the surface of the paint, which was an effect he achieved, in one of infinite variations on the same idea of basically setting out pigment and setting the machine to do its work. I just show you a couple of paintings because I think it's always a nice gauge of kind of where things are. This is by an artist called Li Shurui, a female artist who went to the academy in Sichuan and who's been in Beijing for many years. Typical of this generation of artists, came to Beijing as the assistant to a painter by the name of Chen Wenbo, who's kind of a famous painter from that earlier generation. Worked in one of the galleries and kind of made her way as an artist on her own. And this is called the Tower of Heiqiao, which is the neighborhood where it means Black Bridge, and it's the neighborhood where most of the Beijing artists keep their studios now. But again, it's basically a randomly generated geometric form, which he has painstakingly worked over with markers, just creating this infinite plaid repeating pattern. Another direction in which this generation of artists chooses to go is reflection on the system of art itself. And this is a great piece for talking about that by an artist named Wang Shishun called Uncertain Capital. What he's actually done here is a series of sculptures. Each one is based on the price at which the previous one sold. So this actually consists of, I think it's 20,000 RMB, 1 RMB coins, which are melted down and recast as a cubic solid. And this piece, of course, will probably sell for twice that, and then the next cube will be even bigger. So kind of giving an ironic and a very analytical voice to what is perhaps a defining force in a lot of these artists' careers. And this is kind of one of the interesting things that we found in this exhibition was how actually oppressive this idea of the market can be on these Chinese artists' careers. Where the generation before was kind of yearning for the moment when they would achieve international recognition and commercial success. Now it's actually much more about trying to find a way around that or out of that, and oftentimes that happens by banding together into small collectives who can make work that the market doesn't quite know how to process. This is a piece by an artist called Li Fuchun, who was part of a very interesting collective called Xiaozhizuo, which means small productions is the English name. And he basically found a way to embed works of art into consumer packaging for parcels that were being traded over this website, Alibaba. So it's called B2B2C, and more or less you will receive it's like in the great tradition of conceptualist mail art, but you actually receive a box which contains any number of random products that he's selling on a special store. But inside this box, there's actually the makings of a sculpture, like a rocket ship. Or you have an artist like Xu Chu, who is one of the most well-read on the kind of international art scene that's happening around him, who had an idea similar to ideas that come out of what we're now calling relational aesthetics, and have been for quite a few years already, to introduce a different kind of time into the exhibition. So this installation, which is called It's Not a Matter of Time, involves bottles of bottled water that you'd see on a cooler. And what happens is every day at about 3 o'clock, someone from the water bottle company comes and switches out the bottles of water, and then immediately takes the axe that you see lying on the floor and hacks into the bottle, and it spills out all over the floor. The maid comes and sweeps up some of the water, and then an hour later, someone comes from the cafe across the street and switches out these 2 cups of coffee that lie on top of these black countertops. and then this pile of bottles, it's now, there's now one or two for every day, so there's some 60 bottles kind of all across that wall. But I mean, this is the kind of interrogation of the exhibition system that a lot of conceptual artists have been doing all along, and for him, it's really just a way to talk about the kind of temporality of an art show. What everything is kind of made at different times, but supposed to feel as if it's manifesting different themes in this single zone. And by actually bringing living, working people into this conversation, he kind of opens that space up. Likewise, you have an artist called Hu Xiangqian who's doing things that are quite advanced by any international metric. So this is a performance he put together a few years ago called the Xiangqian Museum of Art. And his name in Chinese actually literally translates as moving forward. So it's a great name, kind of like Leap is a name for a magazine. It's just like, the Moving Forward Museum of Contemporary Art. And this museum has no actual objects in its collection, and he is the director. And he did this incredible performance where he basically stood in front of a brick wall and talked about all the works of art he'd seen that had influenced him over the last few years and reenacted them in different ways. So, talking about pieces like, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Alora and Calzadilla, which is an American artist duo that represented the US at the last Venice Biennale, but a very famous video of theirs where, a motorcycle is retrofitted with a trumpet over the exhaust pipe, and he's kind of there, trying to explain things that are happening in rather sophisticated videos. For our exhibition, he actually did a new project called Hu Xiangqian's solo exhibition at the Xiangqian Museum of Art. And to go another level deeper, on a residency to Italy, he commissioned an Italian artist to similarly perform all of his own previous pieces. So you have this kind of amazing video with, this guy barely speaks Mandarin. So I don't know how they communicated, but they did. And you have this kind of lovely moment where you have this outside interpreter showing you what he's done. This is another piece by Liu Chuang, whose sculpture with the cylinder I showed you a little while before, but which deserved to be put in this grouping. It's called Untitled Dancing Partner. It doesn't take a genius to see that the title, the format of the title is a very specific reference to an artist called Felix Gonzalez Torres, a Cuban-American artist who died actually of AIDS in 1996, and who had an extremely famous piece called Untitled Lovers, which was two clocks next to each other on a wall, just moving in sync. So what Liu Chuang actually did in this piece is commission two identical white sedans to drive at the speed limit around Beijing's Second Ring Road, which completely distorts the traffic pattern and has them record at night. So rush hour would have been a whole different story. But it's recorded from rooftops around the city. And I include this just to talk about how subtle this dialogue is. Okay. It's also important to make the point that it's not all happening on this very refined, aestheticized kind of level, that there still is a deep social impetus to a lot of the art that's being made. And this piece is by an artist duo. Gongjian is a rather interesting figure based in Wuhan, who's very tied up in the sort of civic movement there, which has a lot to do with defending public lands from greedy real estate developers and those kinds of things. This is a painting installation that he made. He and Li Jinghu, another artist from Dongguan, which is a city in southern China where there's a very heavy manufacturing base, made, which basically evokes the state of the urban-rural fringe. They actually are working under this title, urban-rural fringe group. In Chinese, it's a very specific word. It's 城乡结合部, which is kind of where the city ends and the countryside begins. And this is where all sorts of bad things happen, kind of illicit transactions of all manners. The city, as it grows and encompasses new territories, kind of has this temporary state of fringe. And for him, the protagonist of this space is the dog. And so this whole room kind of talks about that through the medium of painting. Or another artist like Yang Xingguang, who actually had the piece in the title slide with the two sticks that say hello at the top, who more easily be seen kind of in the context of a movement like the Gutai, or kind of reacting to that many years later, or Monoha, which is this idea of taking objects as things in themselves. And so this is a landscape, a sculptural landscape that entails just a plain sort of composite board, spray painted white with what resemble trees made from wire, and then resting kind of impermanently on this rock. And his sculptural language is extremely sophisticated because it incorporates things that are doing what they actually do, like this rock holding up this board, and then other things that are kind of drafted into symbolic service, so wires that are supposed to be trees, or spray paint that's supposed to represent snow. And this kind of proliferation of symbolic orders inside a single piece is something that you're just starting to see. Also in the camp of, and this is another big trend, art that looks like that doesn't actually look like it comes from China, is a piece by this artist named Chen Zhou, who was inspired by a small video that you see at the left of Muhammad Ali lighting the Olympic torch in 1996 at the Atlanta Games, already suffering from Parkinson's, which led him to start thinking about Superman, and if Superman would slip on a banana peel if he would encounter one. And kind of this extremely long train of associative thinking that ends up with this painting installation where you, on this screen, which you sit in front of and watch, you have this hired actor dressed like Superman, kind of thinking these melancholy thoughts, and this assemblage of images that kind of tries to probe into this condition. I mean, the interesting thing is here was taking around a curator from the Met not so long ago, whose first response was like, "This looks like it would have been made in Williamsburg, in Brooklyn." And again, I mean, this is in many ways one direction that things are going. This is a piece, I'm sorry, the slides were slightly out of order. I was kind of on the social thinking trend, and now we're back there with a piece that really gets to the heart of this. This is by an artist called Li Liao, whose work was to basically infiltrate a Foxconn factory. Foxconn may be known to some of you as the company, it's a Taiwanese-owned electronic equipment manufacturer, which is Apple's largest assembler and has plants throughout China. It's a company which in recent years has seen a lot of controversy related to worker rights and worker treatment, with quite a number of actually worker suicides from the dormitories. And Li Liao's piece was to get himself a job at one of the Foxconn factories and to work there until he had put together exactly enough money to buy an iPad mini. And what you see in this assemblage, and this is a piece that's gotten a lot of, I mean, the New Yorker wrote it up, and then it's been kind of hotly debated in China, often by actually a lot of people are Apple fans and don't understand that this is art because, again, you're always going to go back to that sort of contemporary art question of like, my 5-year-old could do that, or why is that art? But this assemblage is basically everything from his time at the factory. So you have his working clothes with his employee badge, time card. You have his contract. You have his resignation notice. And then finally you have this iPad, which is on a constant loop showing images that he took around the factory. And of course, these employees are actually inspected every time they enter and leave the factory to see if they have any digital chips on them. The idea being that no images of inside the factory should ever leave. And so there's this absence of actually being able to see the production happening, but the iPad then is engraved with his name and his worker number. We were supposed to be getting a cease and desist letter from Foxconn on this, but it actually hasn't arrived yet, and the show has only got a month left, so we're kind of just biding our time at this point. But this idea of kind of taking one's body and using it as the site for making art actually has a long history, even in contemporary Chinese art. If you look back to people like Zhang Huan, or before that, to someone like Xie Dexin, who's Taiwanese American but has been very influential in China. Anyway, this I thought would be just a nice place to end some of these comments, because it's it takes us back to Maiden. So this is an artist called Zhao Yao, who's a key protagonist in a collective that existed for a few years and is just now disbanded called Guest, named Guest after the anonymous login on the website Art Baba, which I mentioned briefly earlier, which happens to be the login that most people will use if they want to say anything controversial about each other, so as not to have a real name to put with these comments. And so in this show, which was at a gallery called Beijing Commune a year ago, Zhao Yao originated a series of paintings and sculptures called A Painting of Thought and A Sculpture of Thought. And it's actually a really bad translation because what it literally means is like a painting that looks as if it's extremely intelligent. And he essentially took images from these books of brain teasers that he would use as a kid, the sort of thing your parents give you when you're in elementary school, and turn them into the basis for these geometric paintings. You can just see one kind of in the corner there, which is this, one of these colorful matchsticks that have to be rearranged in some kind of way, mounted on a sort of tartan pattern. So even referring back to other kind of positions in painting in China recently, notably someone like Ding Yi. The interesting thing about Zhao Yao and about Guest, and I'm not showing you what he did for our exhibition because he just created a recycling station which will turn all of the refuse from the installation and de-installation of the exhibition into another kind of work, is exactly that. What you have in a practice like this is an attempt to sort of reconcile these two sides, to talk about a specifically Chinese upbringing, but also to create works that will function without any national signifiers in this global domain of contemporary culture of which these artists are now a part. So those are the artists that I wanted to talk about to you tonight, and I'm happy now to talk, to take questions and to continue the conversation in another kind of way. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a question about, has the center ever been in any real trouble for supporting any artists or for a particular exhibition? I'm interested in that. What risk you put forward?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a question I get all the time, and a question that I actually really like to answer because I find it's quite productive. It's interesting how these mechanisms work in relation to different kinds of production and different kinds of circulation. So for example, when I was editing a magazine in China is technically published by a government institution that holds a license. So ours was published by and still is, I just don't work there anymore, by the Anhui Province Federation of Literary and Arts Circles, which is an umbrella kind of Soviet-style organization that houses the Painting Association, the Photography Association, the Writers Association, and so on and so on. And the actual editor-in-chief of the magazine is someone from that organization. And every magazine in China is exactly the same way. So Vogue, for example, is officially called Ornamentation and Decoration. And I believe it's published by the Textile Bureau. Or, a lot of licenses come from tourist organizations in different provinces and cities, or from, the Family Planning Commission, or, wherever. And that is actually the mechanism by which the censorship happens. So, which is to say, it's not as if there's some invisible big brother and things get plucked out or blacked out, without your knowledge. Rather, you have this guy who's, you refer to as, Teacher Joe, and he reads everything when it's still in Word document before it goes into layout and will suggest changes that you can make or not make at your own peril. And of course, there are certain things that cross the line entirely and that need to be struck, but that's actually quite rare. Which is to say, it unfolds in an ongoing process of negotiation. And it's a relationship to manage just like any other, just like all your commercial relationships, just like your internal staff relationships. And that is the form which it takes. And for publications, there's this very well-established mechanism to do this kind of thing because of the nature of printed material. Now, art, it being a new system that's emerged more or less since a lot of this really strict government control has been, if not dissolving, certainly moving in different directions, is in a slightly different place. And that is largely because art kind of fits into a commercial envelope on a lot of levels. So for example, the Ullens Center for Contemporary Art is not technically registered as a nonprofit, because to set up a foreign nonprofit in China is like a nearly impossible thing. The thinking being that if you're not making money, you must be up to something. So we are technically the blah, blah, blah Cultural Communication Company Limited. And that is that's how we're known to the tax authorities. That's how we're known to the Employment Bureau, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the cultural authorities know exactly who we are, and they know exactly what we're doing, and that's because we invite them to all our shows, and we talk to them. It's now, what happens with works when you're bringing works in from outside China? There's a very specific set of processes you have to go through. In fact, two: one with the cultural authorities, and one with the customs authorities. And the first one involves sending thumbnails and dimensions and lists and translations of any text to the Beijing City Bureau of Culture if you're under 120 works, or the actual National Bureau Ministry of Culture if you're over that number. And that is the period during which there is this, works can be vetoed, and they often are. My most favorite example being last year, we did an exhibition of Indian contemporary art. There was a piece by Bharti Kher, who's an Indian artist that might be known to some of you, of a giant fiberglass heart covered in bindis, which she makes a lot of paintings with bindis as well. And the Culture Bureau was absolutely convinced that this was a male reproductive organ. And we were not allowed to show the piece. In fact, you can't even bring it out of customs, because so they think a little bit like seventh graders sometimes too. But then there's other things that actually would be quite, for example, we had an exhibition of photographs from the New Yorker, and anything, like there was one image of an Arab-American mother mourning at the grave of her son who was killed in Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom. And that was not allowed because, you never get an actual explanation, but because it basically looked like something related to the Arab Spring. Similarly, a straight-on portrait by Platon of Gaddafi, denied. So with photographic images, somehow it's a little bit more direct. The interesting thing here now, and then of course the relationship between the Ministry of Culture and Customs is a whole other topic that we could have a separate lecture about, but basically Customs is a lot more powerful and a lot less cultured. So there's that. Then you have the idea of doing a show of work that comes from China. Work that is sourced locally or made in the country. And that's a completely different story. And in fact, there aren't actually formal mechanisms for that same kind of vetting and approval that I was just talking about, because who would do it? Would it be the Beijing Police Department? Would it be, it doesn't quite work in that way. Of course, there's an approval process for exhibitions, but it's not as complicated as all that. And so you're essentially always working on the possibility of something really bad happening, but often it doesn't. And that's the kind of ambiguous, ambivalent state of contemporary art in China that's been in place in different forms for the last 30 years. Going back to the earliest exhibitions, it's this kind of misnomer that exhibitions in China get shut down for good. No, often they're, censored, and then something happens and they reemerge in different forms. At this point, there's enough of there's no formal documents or conventions or treaties that say what isn't allowed. There are certainly times of year that are more sensitive than others. I was faced with a really difficult situation last year. We had to postpone an exhibition by a Japanese artist because it was going to open 2 weeks after all the flare-ups over the senkakus or diaoyus, depending on your side. And we were legitimately worried that we would have angry young men in the space, with sledgehammers destroying the works, and that was not going to be fun for anyone. So it's, I always say that it's, there's a famous New Yorker cartoon of an octopus standing behind a sushi bar, and the sushi chef is saying to him, he thought he could do more good working inside the system. That's kind of how you feel doing any of this in China, because it's a privilege to be there. No one's requiring you to stay, and you do what you can with what you have. But it's I don't know, absolute principles don't necessarily get you as far as an ability to kind of understand the way things are moving and how to kind of play the Taiji game of moving with those forces. So I also should say that the defining principle is don't do anything so direct that it will actually make someone look really bad to their superior, because that's the dynamic on which most organizations run, but also organizations in China. If there's plausible deniability, you're probably okay. The question is there a catalog for the exhibition? It's actually coming out next week. We just sent it off. So it was so much new work that was realized, just in the few days, a few weeks leading up to the show, that it didn't make sense to do one that would have been in the store at the opening, which is, of course, the better scenario. But it's hopefully will be really a reference on this generation for people too. It has a lot of conversations and other kinds of information. So
I'm just curious, given what you just said, how Ai Weiwei is viewed within or by the younger generation in China. With an immense amount of respect. Aside from being a world-renowned activist at this point, he's also probably the most successful artist in pure terms, that China has ever produced. People say he's the most famous artist in the world. It's sort of a hard one to weigh in on. So there's, all the kind of standard feelings of respect, envy, jealousy that, go with someone else's success on one level. Then there's, it was really interesting because I think in some ways he actually believes that none of the Chinese art world shares his convictions or beliefs, mainly because many of the artists of his own generation are so into their cars and wine and cigars that they don't, bother to think about some of the things he thinks about. But it was interesting after his arrest how many people had changed in the art world, changed their sort of Twitter or Weibo avatars into pictures of him. Okay, is that, what kind of a gesture is that really? But it was definitely striking how much kind of latent support there was. On the other hand, there is a sort of, I think there is across the Chinese art world a little bit of Ai Weiwei fatigue, just because he can set up a camera in his kitchen and there'll be like international headlines, whereas meanwhile a whole nother generation is emerging, or hundreds of other artists with significant things to say are practicing, and it kind of eats the column inches for the whole field. So that's all by way of saying, he's viewed kind of exactly as you might suspect or expect.
Can I ask you about something you said before your presentation, where you referred to Vancouver as being in the collective unconscious of people who do contemporary Chinese art? I want to ask you about the role of Chinese overseas. And I know you weren't specifically talking about Chinese overseas when you said Vancouver, but presumably some of that relates to what you said. But the role of Chinese overseas in influencing, in being outlets, in being channels for what's happening in China, and what the connections are internationally, because one of the unique aspects of the Chinese community is its global dimension, the diaspora. Would you say a bit about that?
Absolutely.
And maybe something about Vancouver's special place in this
Sure.
picture. Thanks.
No, you cannot over-exaggerate how important the overseas, I don't know if I would call them overseas Chinese, because that means a very specific thing in Chinese, but Chinese residing abroad, Chinese artists residing abroad were to the development of contemporary art in China through the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. For so many of the artists at that time coming to the US, Canada, Europe, Australia, was such a golden opportunity and such a dream. And they hung on to their Chinese identity in such a way when they got there that there was this constant back and forth, especially after 2000, as opportunities in China have increased, and you see this much bigger shift. The iconic example would be Xu Bing, who left for New York from China in 1989 or 1990, and moved back in 06 or 07 to take up the vice directorship of the Central Academy. But many others like Huang Yongping, who spent the 90s more or less in Europe and is still based in Paris, makes so much work in China today and shows so often in China today, and is actually connected to the conversation in a very meaningful way. What's interesting is, and Vancouver is of course a part of that, and I think has had a history of being
prescient in this way. I mean, just to take some project like Jiangnan, I mean, this is basically at the time when shows like Inside Out or Transience, the first few shows in the West of contemporary Chinese art were happening. This was already an extremely, deep intervention with real connections to people working back there, as opposed to, a traveling presentation of already completed work. And anyway, so that's all that. The interesting thing about this generation is actually that no one actually wants to leave. Suddenly, why would you go? All the curators are coming to China. All the opportunities are there, and there's enough sense of if not freedom, enough sense of opportunity and of room and space to grow and to play that it doesn't feel oppressive, and people don't want to set themselves up for the bother of having to, most of these artists actually don't speak great English because they come up through this kind of, Romanian gymnastics type system of painting classes from a very young age. And even if the art academies are getting a little bit better with the humanities classes, they're not comprehensive universities. They're really first and foremost, kind of, I say Chinese copies of Soviet copies of, French academies of, copies of the Italian academies of like the 18th century. It's a lot of new models and plaster casts. So if you can stay in China, then you might. And now they have access to information in other ways. And so I actually sort of, it's a little bit disturbing in a way, because it was such a healthy back and forth when you really had kind of informants who were of this place and of this culture and time, but who actually had deep connections and experiences in other parts of China. So I mean, every time Sheng comes back, I mean, I always think about his story of in the 80s kind of being in Vienna, and you were taking pictures of a permanent collection at a museum, and were stopped by the director and then told him, that 30,000 people in China will see these photos. You have to let me keep taking them, right? I mean, that is not the case anymore in the way that it was, and it's a little bit dangerous, because other than people who get a chance to go and maybe do an MFA, which are usually people who come from wealthier families, there's not the same back and forth that there was on the level of the actual artists. Sure, they go around for exhibitions, but not as many are putting down roots.
Hi, I'm interested in what you mentioned, like the influences and impact of Taiwanese contemporary artists in the new generation of Chinese contemporary artists. Like, for example, Michael Lin or like Dexin. Can you elaborate for a bit?
Yeah, well, those are two totally different instances. Michael Lin is a kind of, I would say he's like a California artist almost above all. The Taiwanese American artist who works a lot with folk motifs and other kinds of things in this very poppy sort of way, and who's actually been living in Shanghai for the last 7 or 8 years, and is very integrated into the art scene in Shanghai. And that's, I didn't really talk about that tonight, but it is interesting that these art scenes in places like Beijing and Shanghai are no longer just Chinese art scenes. They're becoming international art scenes as well. I have all sorts of artists choosing to make homes and studios there now, and I would put him in that kind of camp, or as an example of that, who's actually been able to engage in China in really meaningful ways, because of course having the name and the identity and stuff does allow for easier bridge building. Xie Dexin is an artist who might not be known to everyone, but who's enjoying a great deal of critical attention right now. This is a guy who basically illegally immigrated to the US in the late 70s and made 5 one-year-long performances, including maybe the most famous where he punched a time card every hour for an entire year. Incredible artist. Very adamant about the fact that he's not Taiwanese, he's not Chinese, he's Taiwanese/American. That's how he prefers to write it. He lives in New York to this day, and actually, I know all this because we're doing a show with him this year, and I'm really excited about it because it'll be the first time that his work has been shown in the mainland. It was diffused through China in the mid-90s through actually the black, gray, and white cover books, which were underground publications that were edited by Ai Weiwei. And indirectly, that's really the basis for Zhang Huan's performances and He Yun Chang and a whole sphere of Chinese artists. So, and that influence kind of was channeled through the person of Weiwei, through these publications and through these conversations with him that were dispersed at a time when there really was very, very little information about contemporary art available. So you do have a lot of these wonderful kind of stories of indirect influence.
I was interested to hear a bit about the lives of this group of artists. What is their material well-being like? Are they supported through, as you say, through the Swiss collectors, the state, or are they living marginally, working side jobs?
Yeah. One of the really interesting things about the Chinese art scene, even at the level of the older, more established artists, some of whom are very wealthy at this point, is that that tends not to enter into the conversation in the ways one might expect. So it's, there's this reputation of Chinese artists for now being so greedy and having so much. And while some of them are extremely successful, that somehow doesn't determine the contours of social circles in the way you think it might. It's much more about this, perceived how good you are as an artist, right? That kind of is what is the determinant of status in these like subgroups. How do these guys actually live? I mean, the ones in this show, most live in apartments. It's interesting because 798 is kind of, there are really very few artist studios left in 798. It's gotten so expensive, but basically everything that has to do with contemporary art in China and in Beijing is in a 10 or 20 minute radius of 798, including this neighborhood, Blackbridge, Heiqiao, which I talked about, which is where I think 60 or 70% of the artists in the show actually have their studios. A lot of them remain connected to the academies in one way or another, teaching, and then a lot of them find opportunities in the creative industries, in advertising and media, and sometimes even in a lot of them have partners who work in galleries or in other like places in the system, and I mean it's I don't know, there's not state funding available for young artists certainly, but it certainly doesn't feel, there doesn't seem to be squalor in the way that there was a few years ago, and it's basically there's a professionalization of the art field that's happening in a very palpable way, which is good and bad, of course. So, anyway.
Great. Thank you so much, Phil.
Thank you.
And thanks to the partners, to Canadian Art Foundation and the Asia Pacific Foundation, and on behalf of the Vancouver Art Gallery. I just want to thank you all for coming and wish you a pleasant evening.